So I released a video a few months ago on why enterprise disks were the go-to choice for home SMB NAS use cases, and I'll link that below. But in that video, I talked about why I had stopped using Western Digital and was buying Seagate disks. And this generated a lot of conversation about people's experiences with each drive manufacturer, and there's a lot of polarized opinion about this. It basically came down to people refusing to either buy Seagate or Western Digital based on prior experience with failures, and a few people questioned why I had not considered Toshiba. This was mostly very reasonable, but it is clear that personal experiences heavily influence our opinions on manufacturers' drive quality, which is probably expected. So today I'm going to go to a large source of disk reliability data and do some in-depth analysis of drives from the major manufacturers and look at their reliability and lifespans. The goal is to take any emotional biases out of the equation and look at the story that the data tells about the drive's reliability. So firstly, the source of this data. Backblaze are a US cloud backup provider who've been around for about 16 years. They are interesting as they not only monitor and record data about their drive performance, but they publish it publicly. And this is awesome, and the data provides insights into the reliability of around 345,000 drives that they have deployed over the last 10 years. 99.65% of these drives are from the four major brands, namely Seagate, Western Digital, Toshiba and HGST. Now, HGST was formed out of IBM and Hitachi, but today it's actually a wholly owned subsidiary of Western Digital. And until late 2015, it ran entirely independently. But as the state of its integration into Western Digital isn't clear from a parts, process and integration standpoint, I'm going to treat them separately for the purpose of this analysis. And I want to say, by the way, a big thank you to Backblaze for sharing their data and allowing its use. The detail it contains reveals really a lot about these drives. A quick note on my methodology, so you can understand what the data contains and how I work with it for this analysis. I took the data, which is a little shy of 200 gigabytes, and put it into a SQL database. This produced around 410 million rows of data on around 345,000 disks used over the last 10.5 years or so. 99.4% of the dataset are spinning disks, with a smaller number of M.2 and SSD disks, which I will ignore for this specific analysis. This is made up of about 140 disk models, of which 87 are consumer models and 40 enterprise models, and there's 4 NAS models, the remainder being laptop disks. Capacities vary from 80 gigabytes at the low end up to 22 terabytes. The standout capacities with the most deployed disks are 4, 12, 14 and 16 terabytes, each with about 60 to 100,000 units. The dataset only contains 66 18 terabyte disks and 4 22 terabyte disks, so as of June 2023, those disks are only really starting to be deployed. The data is made up of about 55% Seagate, 19.5% HGST, 16.7% Toshiba and 8.5% from WD, with 0.3% from Samsung as branded from before the Seagate acquisition. I also cut the Samsung data from the data analysis as the dataset is too small to get firm data from. It's 1200 disks in total and they are mostly 2.5-inch disks. Before we start, a brief history of the hard disk drive brands, so you know where the pedigree, technology and intellectual property comes from. The hard disk industry has been through decades of acquisition and consolidation with just 3 manufacturers remaining today, and these are Seagate, Western Digital and Toshiba. They have around 45%, 36% and 18% of market share respectively. You can see here the history of these acquisitions, and if you've been around for a while you may recognise names from the past such as Samsung, Hitachi, IBM, Maxtor, Quantum, amongst others. According to data from Tom's Hardware, around 50 million hard disks were shipped in Q1 2023, and this is a significant reduction of around 36% year on year. But spinning disks are still the go-to for large-scale cheap storage, and development is still occurring. As we will see, reliability on these disks is generally remarkably good and has been improving over the last few years. So the first insight is the vendor deployment over time in the data. This graph shows the number of operational drives, not just added drives. So as drives are added and removed, the data here shows the net result of that. We will come to deployment and removal rates later in the video. The key here shows HGST in grey, Seagate in green, Toshiba in red and Western Digital coloured blue. Darker colours are the enterprise drives, with the lighter being the consumer units. NAS drives are shown as a middle colour, but the deploy base is so small that it isn't visible here on this graph. we can see that Backblaze originally deployed consumer drives with the bulk from HGST, who are now owned by Western Digital, and from Seagate. HGST enterprise drives started being deployed around March 2014, with Seagate enterprise drives from around March 2017, and by 2017, 50% of disks in service were enterprise disks, which becomes the dominant deployment choice going forward from that point. We can also see that Backblaze has shifted its suppliers around a little, but Seagate has been a consistent supplier, with HGST a preference in early days, and then a shift from them towards Toshiba. Later in the data, we see that they started to deploy more WD drives. There were some WD drives deployed back in 2014, but the numbers were low and they were removed after a few years. There is a lot of data that tells us why some of this may have happened, but it won't just be reliability, it will also be related to supplier availability, terms and conditions such as warranty, and pricing, of course. Backblaze clearly had a preference for consumer drives at the start, which has shifted to enterprise, and they have talked some about this in their published blogs, which is great. HGST drives are still available today, but they do seem hard to get, and it looks like WD favours branding drives as Western Digital and not HGST. And this may explain why deployment of the HGST set has pretty much stopped in the last year and has shifted towards Western Digital. Now let's dive into the drive deployments, so we can see the manufacturer's capacity and quantities deployed over these 10 years. And this aligns with what we saw before, but it adds 4 dimensions to the data. You see the data along the x-axis at the bottom, with the average drive size on the y-axis at the side. The colours represent the suppliers, with green being Seagate and red being Toshiba on the bottom graph, and then grey being HGST and Western Digital coloured blue above. I'm going to use these colours throughout when multiple manufacturers are on the same graph. As the points are using the average drive size, it will primarily be influenced by the major drives being deployed, but can move around a little if some larger or smaller drives are also going into service. We see 2 large blobs back in 2013, which is the existing deployment base when the data starts, averaging at about 2.8 gigabytes. We then see primarily HGST and Seagate 4TB disks until 2016-2017, and then 8TB disks moving to 12 in 2018, and then gradually increasing up to 14 and then 16 terabytes. The visualization clearly shows the brand preference during the period. The size of the bubbles show how many are deployed, and the scale is normalized so you can visually compare. For example, this large Seagate blob in the middle is around 7,200 drives in January 2018, with an average capacity of 12 terabytes. We're actually going to come back to those 12 terabyte drives later. We see how this varies between consumer and enterprise drives, with the consumer drives in grey and the enterprise shown in gold. I think this graph speaks for itself, but again, it shows average capacity and quantity with normalised bubble sizes. Backblaze has talked about its use of consumer drives, but it's clear that it moved towards almost exclusive enterprise drive use in 2017. All this provides context about what Backblaze deployed and operated, but let's now look into the failure data, as this is what is really interesting for those trying to understand drive quality and life. And here we see a chart that shows the timeline along the x-axis and the average lives of drives at the time of failure on the y-axis. So the x-axis here doesn't tell you about the nature of the failures, but when they occurred. You would expect to see a sloping trend up and to the right, likely with increasing failure numbers as shown by the bubble sizes. This is because as drives are deployed longer, their lifetime hours will increase. The failures shown in the bubble sizes are not failure numbers specifically, as the quantity deployed by each vendor varies greatly and are not comparable. Instead, these bubbles represent the percentage of current in-service disks that fail in each month. Some observations here are that the percentage failure rates on the blue WD drives are large before 2021, but still spread between 0 and 50k hours of service, and this can be explained by the small deploy base. Any single or small numbers of failure is going to result in a larger percentage. We also see that HGST in grey, Seagate in green and Toshiba in red have comparable failures, with Toshiba having a slightly shallower slope, indicating that failures happen a little earlier, but the fail percentages are also a little lower. HGST drives have smaller failure rates, which suggests better survivability. The number of blue WD failures are quite small, but they are less consistent and more of them fall in the 0 to 20k hours range, which isn't a good indicator. One brand being lower or higher on the graph doesn't really indicate anything other than the batch of deployed disks was bought online later, so it has less hours on them. It's really the angle, the consistency of the trend that is more interesting, along with the size of the bubbles. Recently, more WD drives are being deployed, but the failure percentages look small and are very scattered, and this is probably because they've not been in service long enough to develop a firm trend. The other interesting thing we see here is a large collection of failures for Seagate back in the 2013 to 2015 range, and these are consumer drives that failed before reaching much more than 20,000 hours. It has been suggested that Backblaze's choice to use consumer drives on this kind of workload is likely the reason, and they do seem to have moved towards enterprise drives. However, looking at the data, we see that consumer and enterprise drives in the past 5 years or so seem to have similar survival rates. There is a lot of data that I will have to come to in a follow-up, but this is one thing that is interesting. What is also possible is that these drives in 2013-2015 timeframe were simply not at the same quality and tended to fail earlier. In 2011, Thailand suffered catastrophic flooding that massively impacted hard disk manufacture, for which a large majority was performed in the country. Seagate, Toshiba and WD were all heavily focused in Thailand and had to move capacity elsewhere, but the data suggests that quality has improved since. Those failures would be for drives deployed in the 2011 to 2013 timeframe, and the drive shortages and pricing may also be a factor that led Backblaze to deploy consumer drives at that time. You can also see from the scale on the right that despite the size of these bubbles, they do generally represent very small percentages. For example, the very top to the right bubbles here represent only about a 0.25% failure rate, meaning that for all in-service Seagate drives, only about 1 in 400 failed in each month, and they had an average drive power on time of around 46,000 hours, which is around 5.25 years. The absence of bubbles in the bottom right of the graphs is a good sign for drive reliability, with the current deploy base from Seagate having an average age failure rate above 35,000 hours for the last couple of years, which is around 4 years. I stress though that these are averages and a deeper dive is needed to identify more granularity. And it is worth noting, these are the failure ages for failed drives. There's obviously a lot of drives, a large percentage that did not fail and continue to run in service. To draw strong conclusions, we need to go a bit deeper, and the data tells us that there are some specific drive models from different vendors that had high failure rates, and these skew the data significantly. These shouldn't be excluded from the data because it's a problem if models without adequate QA are mass shipped, but it's worthy of more analysis. What we can infer from what we've seen so far is that HGST appear to have a more robust drive, with Seagate following and Toshiba appearing to have a slightly lower reliability. But it doesn't look like any of the brands are significantly worse. Some manufacturers had specifically bad models in the data that have hurt their stats, and there is the possibility that the drives themselves were actually not the issue and that it's just that a batch got damaged in transit. But we need to dig deeper to assess the likelihood of that. The jury may still be out on Western Digital as the historical data doesn't make them look the best. And actually the small deployment of WD NAS drives had bad failure stats. It's early for the newer enterprise disk, but initial signs do look good. Maybe some of that HGST pedigree has helped here. And of course, pricing, brand reputation, etc. will all play a role in your decision. And I talked in the link video below about my recent experiences with Western Digital and how it affects my decision process. A really strong technical reason to go to WD might sway me, but I don't see it here, at least for now. We're going to check back in as Backblaze release more data. There is a lot more in the data that's worthy of exploration, and I will be making some more content on all of this. This includes failures versus decommissions, which reveals some interesting things, as well as the direct comparison of these numbers between the vendors. I'm also going to be looking at the specific models and failure rates and focusing on the currently available 10 to 18 terabyte range. And if you want to catch that, don't forget to subscribe. The 12 terabyte Seagate drives I mentioned earlier are especially interesting, as the data reveals a specific model that was deployed at scale and then almost completely removed again due to high failure rates. And we're going to dig into that in a follow-up. Also, if this was interesting, please do hit the thumbs up. It really helps with channel growth and reach, and it tells me that this content is interesting and that I should make more of it. And if you want to comment on my observations or you have your own to add, please also drop them in the comments. I'm always interested in constructive feedback and ideas from my viewers. And above all, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next.